make moral compromises that could have led to his death. But finally, it's his just observations and the tone poem of Vietnam succumbing to factional violence and moving into the future. He says more often, this is a medieval society, and he's kind of watching this beautiful medieval society succumb to modernity.
Yep. Um, so it looks like we cut out for a second, so I'm not sure how that on-screen thing is going to work. We apologize. So we have Anne's Rants here in the chance has actually a good question. Can you talk about Greene's intersection in his own life with communism, his relationship to Kim Philby? So I think this is actually really interesting because um, Greene wrote the introduction to Philby's memoir. He went to Moscow in the mid
Well, let's
'70s.
remind people who Philby was.
Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, and who was the other one? I'm trying to remember who the other
McLean, Alistair
McLean.
McLean.
Yeah. So there was uh, a group of British students from Cambridge, from remembering correctly, right? Was it Cambridge?
I can't be sure, but yeah, and they were MI6. They were British intelligence.
They were all British
Uh,
intelligence, and they were it was they were essentially the analog, um, to the great who's the character who was in Breach, the American who worked for the FBI, who got caught, or Aldrich James or somebody like that. But this was a much bigger deal. They were double agents for the Soviet Union at a
and
crucial
people
time.
people in the upper echelons of British society, trained at Eton and places like that, what they call the public schools, Eton, Rugby, Harrow, etc. In some cases, gay, at a time when there was, a lot of closeted gay people
I think they
about
all were gay.
yeah, about the British upper class and diplomatic service and military and society in general, but it was a deeply closeted uh, uh, world. They also were, supposedly fighting the Soviet Union. They were engaged in the twilight battle of, communism versus capitalism, and they were traitors.
Yeah, and it's so strange, we look back on it, we think, well, why why did MI6 hire a bunch of people from the university who were members of young communist clubs to fight the Soviet Union? Uh, it seems like it's a little bit of a lax security protocol, but it happened. Philby and Burgess were, two of the biggest intelligence embarrassments in the history of the West, and Greene was a deputy to Philby, uh, and was loyal to him essentially to the end. He again wrote the introduction to Philby's memoir. He excused it, said, "Haven't we all, um, compromised or betrayed something for a higher cause once at some point in our lives?" Then again, he wrote this book, A Human Factor, where it's another very Greenian character who is moved um, to spy for the Russians because he's so repulsed by the American alliance with the South African regime, and so there's a lot of sympathy there for uh, the socialists and for uh, the other side,
And
and
people need to understand that upper class socialism slash communism in Britain was quite common going back to the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th. The so-called Fabian socialists, people like Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, the great historian and novelist, and so on, were themselves hoping for what we would now call a globalist socialist society. They saw it as inevitable, they saw it as just, they saw it as the correction to the horrors of Victorian industrialism that Dickens and others, portrayed. And so in some ways, yeah, it's a security breach, but you would have a hard time not getting people of this flavor
That's true.
from Oxford and Cambridge at the time. And the other thing to appreciate about British society, and I'm just going to trade in cultural stereotypes. I don't have enough time, to break them down and pack them into euphemisms and dissolve them in, just talk. Britain and England and its upper class hierarchy are a place of secrecy, secrecy and hypocrisy. Even to be a Catholic, a Roman Catholic in England, was for a long time to be in a sort of hated minority. To be homosexual, to be gay, certainly. To maybe at times to be other things. And how can I say this? It is that practice of secrecy, that talent for living double lives, and for sort of hiding the true self, that I think makes British spies great. Probably in some ways some of the best that have ever lived. And their spying services go back before this century, believe me, hundreds of years. And so that Greene kind of says, oh, well, a complicated traitor who, ended up defecting and so on isn't such a big thing. He had a higher calling. An American wouldn't understand that. We're patriots,
Yeah.
right or wrong, true blue or not, democracy or communism. But in England, there are so many layers to the self, to society, to how people present themselves, to their loyalties and so on, that, you know, it's very hard to get, a stubborn, straightforward personage, especially of those classes.
Yeah. I think that's right. We just wouldn't. We don't have that kind of person trying to be in the intelligence services here in America, or not that many, right? I mean, John Brennan was a communist. He voted for Gus Hall in 1976, but there wasn't this expectation that the person who went into the secret services was going to be this highly literate, you know, Renaissance figure who had lots of different kinds of interests. Like one of the points of this book is that the American is who's replacing the Brits. They're not that kind of intellect. They are sort of one-note thinkers, and there isn't that kind of thing. So I think that made a difference with Greene. I also I'm not entirely unconvinced that he himself wasn't didn't betray the service once upon a time. So he kind of hints at that many times. All right, here's a question. Can you comment on Greene's apparent commentary on journalism and the journalist class 1955 versus 2025? Hang on a sec. Well, look, as Walter mentions, he hits every note about how foreign correspondents worked and still do work, at least last time I checked. There's a great scene where a bunch of journalists are talking about how they're complimenting one of them for this story he wrote about called, what is it called, Walter? Like the dangerous highway or something like that.
Right.
And it's all about how perilous and it is to be anywhere near there, and the gunfire is like incessant. But of course, he's never been anywhere near the place, and he even defends that in the story, and that's a classic theme of, as you say, sort of British journalism. It was one of the it's practically the whole plot of Scoop, which is Evelyn Waugh's novel about this. Here's what he writes. What does he write? You think I'd really go near their stinking highway? Stephen Crane could describe a war without seeing one. Why should I? It's only a damn colonial war anyway. So he gets at the kind of like laziness of this generation of reporter, and I saw a lot of these folks in their last gasp, I guess, overseas, but they've been replaced by people who are actually more like the York Harding he's satirizing in this book, who are themselves, zealots, and that's exactly what this person is not.
Well, okay, so after I went to Oxford, I decided I wanted to live maybe the rest of my life in London and be a playwright and support myself in maybe journalism and literature. So I made an honest try to fit into British society. First job I got was at a law firm. And I was a private detective, basically. It was kind of like a journalist. I wrote reports about people who were infringing on intellectual property, Anyway, uh, here's what a day at the office was like. You got there at 10. Um, you shuffled papers, said hello, had your first cup of tea, your morning pick me up, and so on, and then you waited until 11:30, which actually meant 12. That last half hour was just waiting for 12. Then you went to the pub. You got back from the pub at 11, or I mean 1:30, after having had a few drinks, and you then closed the door to your office. All the partners in the law firm, not just junior little Walter, the private detective, and you heard snoring until about 3:30. That meant 3:30 meant that at 4, the cart was going to come around with this orange drink they called orange squash, which is like Tang, because when I was in England in the 1980s, it was still suffering post-war deprivation. Like they didn't have things like real orange juice, okay, and they still drank instant coffee rather than filter coffee, they called it. Anyway, at 4, the orange Tang came around, and everybody woke up from their naps. And at 5, which starts at 4:30, everybody left, and the senior members of the law firm went to their clubs in London for dinner. They didn't go home. They went, had preprandial drinks, a long dinner, and then they had brandy and schnapps or whatever after dinner. Got home at 10 and slept a sodden night of absolute alcoholic bliss. Day after day, this went on. And that's who we're talking about. You know that guy in your college who boasted that he never went to the library, or he passed without ever cracking the textbook. In England, in a certain rank, that is the highest aspiration. To mate absolute lack of work with last minute results that are passable is everything someone aspires to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've actually, in my own, when I worked, did some stringing for British papers. Um, it was made clear to me in certain ways that they were not particularly worried about how accurate the reporting was, but they sure as hell liked the writing. So that's kind of where Fleet Street that dynamic was. Like they didn't care if you slept and drank and maybe didn't develop sources and all that stuff, but as long as you could write a good sentence and
If you want to think about Fowler, just remember Christopher Hitchens.
oh yes, exactly, yeah.
Remember somebody like Christopher Hitchens, who is so brilliant that they don't want to sully they don't want to sully their reputation with the thought that they work hard. You're supposed to be able to wake up from a hangover and win a debate, and then go drink again. So the portrait of journalism is both cynical, realistic, but also, I think, in some ways, trenchant. In other words, meaningful. Fowler doesn't believe you can describe the world accurately. The British don't really believe you can get the news In fact, there's even a line about the news early in the book. You know, he says something about, like, I used to believe in the news. And one of his raps against Pyle is that he reads serious books. He loves serious literature. The reason isn't just laziness or sort of prep school sloth, that journalists don't work too hard. It's that they don't believe that what they do is real.
Yeah.
In other words, they tell stories. Their job is to write up, amazing battles or incidents, or sort of in a Mark Twainish way. But they finally don't believe in journalism,
Yeah.
and and Pyle believes in everything. He's Superman. He's Clark Kent.
Yeah.
You know.
He's a believer, and York Harding is his true north. This idiot pundit. One of the questions we had before is who's the modern equivalent
Of York Harding.
Yeah, well, to Pyle, but you can imagine both Pyles and York Hardings. I mean, I think Jake Sullivan is a great example. Victoria Newland is another Pyle, right? But the York Harding character is Max Boot.
Samantha
It's Bill
Power.
Kritzel. Yeah, Samantha Power, right? That's a
Anne
Pyle.
Applebaum.
And Applebaum.
Kagan.
Hmm.
You know, it's not that Pyle grows up to be Dick Cheney, but Dick Cheney's his boss. I mean, Dick Cheney, the Dark Lord who kind of knows he's evil, is a little different than Pyle. Pyle preserves his illusions about himself right to the end. He's bringing apple pie, the American way, democracy, and the fall of China to Vietnam. Um, he really does remind me of maybe a young George Bush, or the best and the brightest. He's the best and the
Right.
brightest. He is Robert McNamara.
Yeah, I
He
was
is,
gonna say McNamara or any of those Camelot figures, right?
yes, or Lansdale. If you're deep into CIA and spy lore, you'll recognize maybe this character named Edward
Edward
Lansdale,
Lansdale, yeah.
who is said to be the actual progenitor or model for Pyle in the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one last note about there's a lot of little asides in here in the book about the journalism that let you know that Greene definitely was one, because you wouldn't get the humor um, unless you actually lived that life. There's a moment where uh, he finds out that Pyle has been killed, and the question a human being would immediately consider would be, how do I tell Foon this, right? Like, how do I break the news? But he
Right.
says, I think in headlines, American official murdered in Saigon, right? Like, and that's something that clearly he had that. And then there's this great passage where he talks about where he's briefly serious. Um, he says, "You can rule me out." He's talking about something about his own potential involvement in Pyle's death. He says, "You can rule me out. I'm not involved. Not involved." I repeated. It had been an article of my creed. The human condition being what it was, let them fight, let them love, let them murder. I would not be involved. My fellow journalists called themselves correspondents. I preferred the title of reporter. I wrote what I saw. I took no action. Even an opinion is a kind of action. Um,
And Matt, how does that contrast with what the New York Times espouses now? Activist journalism. I
right,
mean,
moral clarity.
that's more American foolery. The notion that I'm going to change the world with my, journalism. Pyle, excuse me, Fowler knows there's no changing the world with little stories sent across the wires.
And that even that little sentiment there, like, I let out a little cheer when I read that, because now everybody wants you to take sides now on everything, and the taking of sides is what got us in this mess. I feel like, um, if we could just sort of sit back and describe it, I think we'd all be better off. But
Well, maybe as we lose our empire or lose it at the edges, we'll become a little more fatalistic and a little bit more detached and, you know, zen about uh, events, current affairs, and the news. I think we're at a point, frankly, in the development of American culture when we've really realized finally, and in a cynical but I think truthful way, that most of what we call journalism is an expression of tribal sentiment or an attempt to entertain, get clicks, support your political side, and so on. But it's pretty hard for us to go back, I think, to the real belief in truth telling, uh, you know, getting results, bringing justice, except for Matt Taibbi,
yeah, I know.
who we're seeing live experience the identity crisis that's talked about in the book, I
It,
think.
that's true. Yep. Um, and I just heard we just hear from one of our listeners here that apparently Germany has approved the use of long-range missiles against Russia. So um, that's a
Long range
thing.
missiles that it will import to Ukraine or fire
I
from
don't know.
Germany.
I guess I mean we'll get to this in the show later this week, which will be more of a news show, obviously, much more.
Yeah.
But uh, I think yeah, he's describing a world that used to be kind of standard, and foreign correspondence. That I mean, I'm kind of glad I got to witness this at the tail end of it because it was sort of an ethos of the you could completely imagine this character who's smoking opium and in bed with his mistress all day long, and has some kind of deal worked out where with the authorities that allows him to break a story technically by filing to France like a few
Right.
minutes ahead of time. He break the story of Pyle's death. It was a very clubby little scene overseas for reporters for years and years and years, and as Wall wrote about, it was often a very financially comfortable arrangement too, where you had every conceivable kind of equipment and um, you know uh, personnel to help you with things and servants and free rent and all kinds of stuff like that, and they lived a life. These characters, but Greene also was an additional subspecies of this, which was the intelligence figure whose cover was that of a journalist. And I don't know how many of those I met, but probably a few. We don't know now how that works. I mean, I don't know personally how that works in America, but I'm assuming that tradition's not dead, either. Or, but I don't know.
Dude,
What do you think
uh,
about that one, Walter?
well, what you just said is something interesting. I've always noticed through my life that journalists wish they were spies and spies wish they were writers.
Mm,
Every spy has a novel in them or something.
everyone. Howard
Yep,
Hunt. Yep.
yep. And every journalist really wants to get close to the action and trade secrets and, maybe cause things to happen or at least, be the first to know and somehow change the fate of things. So there is a face off in this book between the spy and the journalist. The spy believing still in the efficacy of action, and the journalist almost, I mean, at some point, Fowler says something like, I'm not a pacifist because I believe that when you kill a man in war, you're doing him a favor. Life is so tragic, life is so painful, life is so, fraught that to die young and even to die at the hands of your enemy is something you should almost be grateful for. That's
Mm,
how that's how exhausted, almost suicidal Fallow, Fowler is. If not for the love of this woman, you get the sense that he just swallow a ball of opium
Oh,
and
yeah.
drift off to death, you know.
Hmm.
And that's another thing that's important to remember. We talk about the unreliable narrator in literary classes. That means somebody who tells a story, but they're so self-serving and they're so maybe delusional that they can't tell it honestly. Not only is Fowler unreliable because of his emotions, his love for this woman, and so on, and his bitterness and jealousy, but he's high. He in the first chapter, when he goes to receive the news of the death, he's just had his third hit of opium, his third pipe, and this is a book that's very specific about the mechanics and the nature of opium addiction, which I think is great. I mean, it's the fourth bowl that makes you not be able to sleep with your mistress. But at the third bowl, he points out you are very eloquent and a clear thinker because you kind of he says that opium actually helps you become quick-witted because you don't care about little shit anymore. You see right to the essence of things.
Yeah, other
So
things don't bother you, so the problem is just a little pearl you get to concentrate on.
yeah, it makes opium addiction very attractive. I think, it not only ritualistically to have this beautiful woman loading your pipe and handing it to you, but but spiritually, it gives you just enough a detachment from this wicked, wicked world full of serious people blundering along and accidentally killing others. The opiate distance is for Greene, in so far in the book, a kind of great way to go through life. Every once in a while you can't get it up, but they don't care as long as you don't leave them, he says.
Right, and as long as a CIA agent doesn't show up and screw things up, um, who just happens to want your mistress, like what? How screwed up is that? No, it's really funny that you mentioned that because I forget what the name of the book was, but Mark Twain once wrote a book about with this theory about who Shakespeare really was.
Yeah.
I forget what the name, what the title was, but it was a detective story where he was trying to piece things together by noting how in command Shakespeare was of certain topics. Like this was a person who clearly spent a lot of time around courts,
Right.
who
He
had
believed that he had had a legal education.
a legal education, had was a good sailor, and there were a bunch of other things. Like in other words, writers, you can tell when a writer uh,
Knows what he's talking about.
knows what he's talking about because the detail it rings true, and that's not necessarily a consequence of reporting. That's just something that happens with writing. Like that when you know exactly what all the steps are, you just tend to do it better than somebody who has to imagine it from scratch. And so you can tell in this book that
He
Greene
smoked
is
a few bowls of opium.
exactly that he's familiar with opium. He's familiar with what it feels like to wake up next to a 20-year-old Vietnamese girl, and he also knows what it is to file to France in the middle of the night. As part of his job. That which is, in other words, he really was a correspondent. Like you can tell that this is a person who knew all these things, and there are actually, and I didn't know this until I read some things about this book. There are the stories interspersed with actual real characters from history or from that time period, and it's much less an invented story than I thought when I first read it. Like there were a lot of details that actually correspond with things that happen in time. But all those things, there's a lot of narrative giveaways about what he really knew and what he was comfortable writing about. But
But looking back on it now, 70 years, 1955, right? Um, what is amazing is that this fatalism, this sense that the beauty and the mystery of Vietnam will go on, but no one will really own it. No one will, no one will master it. It's tragic, deep, mysterious nature, and maybe that's a cliche, you know, the inscrutable Oriental, will abide. But what's funny is that Vietnam now, my son went there not too long ago, is a go capitalist, build it, make money society. And strangely enough, though Greene's the Graham Greene's picture of the American attitude and its incompatibility with the Vietnamese soul might have felt very prescient in 1980, 5 years after the war ended. Vietnam today is a commercial, driving, Americanized society, which I just saw is putting in a Trump golf course.
Is it really?
Yes. So, who really won in the end? You know, and that's why I want people to read it with a sense of whether or not he's being unfair to the American uh, sensibility and temperament. Because the Vietnam of today, if you look inside your clothing, is where it's manufactured. And the streets are bustling with people trying to make a dollar, and it is a rising economy in Asia that has fully embraced many aspects of Americanism that Graham Greene deplored.
Yeah, but it also had to go through horrors to get there. But and those horrors, you know, the Agent Orange, the
Sure.
the defoliation campaign, like the bombing of Cambodia, all the stuff that happened in that war was directly the result of people like Pyle who just thought they could bomb their way back to victory somehow, force the York Harding vision of the world into place, and it was tragic for a whole generation of people, and it had a huge impact on our culture.
Oh yeah.
Even today, you know, we're still living through that. I think cultural argument, right?
We are. I mean, I just added that observation
Mm-hmm.
for ironic purposes because, as I say, you know, Vietnam has changed a lot.
Sure, no, no, absolutely.
But the reason I first read this book, 1979, I was at Macalester College in Minnesota, my first year of college, and there was a class on the Vietnam War that was taught by a former State Department, a very high State Department official who had been in Vietnam during the war. And Macalester was a kind of a radical school that had almost famously protested the war. And this weary and I think rather cynical and State Department official wanted to tell us the real story of what happened. And he said, there's no better way to start to tell the real story of American Vietnam than to read The Quiet American. For him, it was a historical document, not a novel, not a soap opera, not a love story, but a true account of the tragic mistakes and mismatches of American policy and Vietnamese reality.
Yeah, and it's replicated itself over and over again. Iraq is the quiet American. Ukraine is the quiet American. I don't think Israel Gaza is really the quiet American because that's its own holy war that we play kind of a peripheral. Well, I mean we play
But
an
all through,
important part, but
but all through Central and South America,
right.
anywhere where the U.S. has, you know, fostered what might be called a color revolution or a real revolution or a fascist reaction to a revolution, you have the quiet American. He is the Ivy League, upper class, J press, you know, classic diplomat undercover or economic development guy who comes to a very complicated country and doesn't even speak the language.
And isn't interested in it either.
No.
Yep. Hmm. Yeah, so it's a great introduction to everything that's kind of erroneous and dangerous about the American foreign policy, and it's written hilariously and, as you say, with great detail. And
It's a Harvard man goes to the tropics and fucks everything up.
Exactly, exactly. So we'll in the next show, I guess we'll tell you how it all winds up. And apologies everybody for the technical difficulty there. We'll try to get that worked out by the next time. But we're glad to be back, and we'll see you again soon. So thanks everybody.
See you then.